Last summer, I walked out to my vegetable beds one quiet morning and noticed the same discouraging sight I had seen for years. Tiny green aphids covered the stems of my kale and cabbage plants. Ants moved up and down the leaves in steady lines, almost like little workers guarding the pests instead of fighting them. I had already spent several seasons trying to control the problem. I sprayed neem oil. I rinsed plants with water. I tried homemade soap mixtures and natural sprays from the garden center. Some things slowed the damage for a few days, but nothing truly solved it. What surprised me most was not how difficult the pests were. It was how quickly things changed once I stopped focusing only on the aphids themselves. Within about a week of changing my approach, the ant trails around my brassica beds nearly vanished. A few days later, the aphids began disappearing too. It felt strange at first because I was using less product, less spraying, and less effort than before. For many years, I believed stronger action meant better results. But in this case, the opposite turned out to be true. The garden improved once I understood what was really happening between the insects. And if you have ever felt tired of spraying plants over and over without lasting results, I want to reassure you that you are not alone. Many gardeners go through the same cycle for years before realizing the real issue is often hidden beneath the surface. Before explaining why this happened, it helps to understand the relationship between ants and aphids. At first glance, aphids seem like the main problem. They gather under leaves, cluster around stems, and slowly weaken plants by sucking sap from tender growth. Leaves curl. New growth becomes distorted. Plants stop looking healthy and strong. But the ants nearby are often just as important to the story. Aphids produce a sticky sweet substance called honeydew. Ants love it. In many gardens, ants actually protect aphids the same way farmers protect livestock. They guard them from predators like ladybugs and lacewings. Sometimes ants even carry aphids from one plant to another. So when gardeners spray aphids but ignore the ant colony, the problem often returns very quickly. Once I understood this, the entire pattern finally made sense. Every time I removed visible aphids, the ants simply helped new ones return. The cycle repeated all season long. That realization changed the way I looked at pest control completely. Instead of trying to fight every insect I could see, I began paying attention to the system behind the damage. That slower way of observing the garden taught me much more than years of spraying ever did. The method I eventually settled on came from a conversation with an older gardener at a small local market. We started talking about cabbage worms and aphids, and he casually mentioned using a simple mineral-based bait many years ago. He explained that the goal was not to kill insects quickly. The goal was to interrupt the colony itself. That idea stayed with me because it sounded so different from modern garden advice. Most products promise fast results. But fast results often disappear just as quickly. When I tried this slower method for the first time, I honestly was not expecting much. But after several days, I noticed something unusual. The ant activity around the beds actually increased at first. More ants appeared around the bait stations. In the past, I would have assumed the method was failing. But this time I waited. A few days later, the trails began thinning out. Then they almost disappeared entirely. And once the ants were gone, the aphid numbers slowly collapsed too. The mixture itself is surprisingly simple. I use 1 cup of warm water, 3 tablespoons of sugar, and 1 teaspoon of boric acid powder. I stir everything carefully until the liquid becomes fully clear. Then I soak cotton balls in the mixture and place them inside shallow lids or small containers near active ant trails. I always keep the bait stations low to the ground and protected from rain. Usually I slide them under a loose stone, a small piece of wood, or an overturned flower pot with a small opening on one side. This keeps the mixture from washing away and helps prevent pets or wildlife from reaching it easily. One of the most important lessons I learned was that weaker mixtures often work better than stronger ones. Many people understandably assume that adding more powder will solve the problem faster. I used to think the same thing. But when the concentration becomes too strong, worker ants die before carrying the bait back to the colony. The slower approach is actually more effective because the ants continue sharing the mixture inside the nest. That patience can feel uncomfortable at first. Gardeners are used to wanting immediate visible results. But with this method, the first signs of success are often subtle. The garden changes quietly. Usually within 2 days, I notice more ants gathering around the stations. By day 5 or 6, the movement slows down. Around a week later, many of the trails disappear completely. Weather also plays a role. In cooler climates, results may take slightly longer because insect activity naturally slows down. In very hot regions, colonies may stay active much longer through the season. But the general pattern tends to remain the same. One thing I appreciate about this approach is that it requires observation more than hard physical work. Once the stations are placed, there is not much to do except monitor the changes calmly over several days. That can be especially helpful for older gardeners who no longer enjoy constant spraying, bending, or carrying heavy equipment around the yard. Over time, I also started using a second method for pests that crawl close to the soil line. Some insects, like earwigs, cutworms, and squash bugs, tend to move along the lower parts of plants. For those pests, I sometimes apply a very light dusting of boric acid around the base of stems. The important word there is light. I never pile it heavily onto the soil. I never spread it broadly through the bed. And I never place it on flowers where bees and pollinators visit. Instead, I use only tiny amounts in narrow targeted areas where crawling pests travel. A small squeeze bottle works well because it allows careful placement without overusing the powder. This matters because boron is something plants actually need in very small amounts. It is a natural micronutrient. But too much can harm vegetables. Excess boron may cause yellowing leaves, weak growth, or stressed plants. That is why moderation becomes so important. In gardening, more is not always better. Sometimes gentle adjustments create the healthiest results. I think many gardeners become frustrated because they feel pressure to act constantly. Every insect feels like an emergency. Every damaged leaf feels like failure. But gardens are living systems. Some pests will always appear. The goal is balance, not perfection. Once I accepted that idea, gardening became calmer and far more enjoyable. I also became more careful about timing. Rainy weather can reduce the effectiveness of dry powders and barriers very quickly. If heavy dew or rain is expected, I usually wait for another day before applying anything. A dry morning or calm evening tends to work best. This slower seasonal rhythm helped me notice other things too. For example, after the ant populations declined, I began seeing more natural predators return to the beds. Ladybugs appeared more often. Small spiders started building webs between plants again. Lacewing larvae showed up beneath leaves. Those helpful insects had probably always been nearby. But once the ants stopped protecting aphids so aggressively, the garden started balancing itself naturally. That was one of the most encouraging parts of the whole experience. Instead of feeling like I needed to fight nature constantly, I finally felt like I was working alongside it. Another interesting discovery came later when I experimented with different bait ingredients. Plain white sugar worked reasonably well. But after reading about traditional sweet baits used in older gardening methods, I decided to test blackstrap molasses. The difference surprised me immediately. The richer smell seemed to attract ants much faster than plain sugar alone. The stations emptied more quickly, and activity increased sooner after placement. Now my preferred mixture includes 1 cup of warm water, 3 tablespoons of sugar, 1 teaspoon of boric acid, and 1 tablespoon of blackstrap molasses. The molasses does not seem dramatic at first glance. But in my own garden, it noticeably improved the attractiveness of the bait. I suspect the stronger scent plays an important role. Ants rely heavily on chemical signals and food detection. The deeper smell of molasses may simply stand out more strongly than refined sugar by itself. Still, I try to keep expectations realistic. No garden method works perfectly in every climate or situation. Some seasons are wetter than others. Some years insect pressure becomes unusually heavy. Different ant species also behave differently depending on the region. But overall, this slower approach has been far more dependable for me than repeated spraying. And perhaps even more importantly, it reduced the stress I used to feel every summer. I remember one season years ago when I sprayed my vegetable beds almost constantly. Every few days I mixed another batch of something. Neem oil, soap spray, garlic mixtures, pepper solutions. I spent more time reacting to pests than enjoying the garden itself. Eventually I realized I was exhausting myself while the insects adapted faster than I could respond. That experience taught me something valuable. Healthy gardens often come from steady observation rather than constant intervention. Now I spend more time watching plant behavior closely. I notice where pests gather first. I watch which plants stay healthiest naturally. I pay attention to moisture levels, airflow, and seasonal changes. Those quiet observations often prevent problems before they become severe. For example, crowded plants tend to trap humidity and create hiding places for aphids. Weak stressed plants also attract pests more easily. By spacing vegetables properly and avoiding excessive fertilizer, I noticed fewer infestations overall. Strong tender growth created by too much nitrogen can attract aphids quickly. Slower balanced growth tends to resist problems better. That does not mean gardeners should become fearful of feeding plants. Vegetables still need nutrients. But moderation matters there too. One thing I appreciate about older gardening wisdom is how often it encourages balance instead of extremes. Modern gardening advice sometimes pushes people toward constant products and endless corrections. But many experienced gardeners quietly rely on patience, timing, and careful observation instead. That slower pace may not sound exciting, but it often creates healthier gardens in the long run. Another benefit of targeted baiting is that it reduces unnecessary harm to helpful insects. Broad spraying can affect pollinators and predators along with pests. But carefully placed bait stations stay mostly focused on ants themselves. I still take precautions, though. I never place bait near flowering plants where bees forage regularly. I avoid open exposed stations. And I prefer working during early morning or evening when pollinator activity is lower. Simple habits like these make a noticeable difference over time. As the seasons passed, I also noticed something interesting emotionally. I became less reactive in the garden. Small pest sightings no longer felt alarming. I stopped expecting perfect leaves on every plant. That change probably improved the garden just as much as the pest method itself. Stress often pushes gardeners toward overcorrecting. We spray too much. Water too often. Fertilize too heavily. Dig constantly. But plants usually respond best to steadier conditions. Sometimes stepping back slightly allows the garden to stabilize naturally. I think this is especially true for senior gardeners who want to enjoy their outdoor spaces without turning every season into exhausting work. There is a quiet satisfaction in finding methods that reduce effort while improving results at the same time. And that does not mean ignoring problems. It simply means responding thoughtfully instead of urgently. Over the years, I have learned that insects themselves are not always the enemy. They are often signals. Aphids may indicate overly soft growth. Ants may point toward hidden colonies nearby. Fungal problems often reflect excess moisture or poor airflow. When we observe these patterns calmly, the garden begins teaching us what it needs. That mindset changed gardening from a battle into a conversation. One summer after using these bait stations consistently, I harvested the healthiest kale crop I had grown in years. The leaves stayed cleaner longer. The plants looked less stressed. And perhaps most importantly, I spent far less time fighting problems every week. The garden finally felt peaceful again. That peacefulness matters more than many people realize. As we get older, the garden often becomes more than just a place to produce vegetables. It becomes somewhere we slow down. Somewhere we notice birds, wind, insects, and changing seasons. Somewhere we reconnect with quiet routines that feel grounding and steady. Methods that support that slower experience tend to last because they fit naturally into everyday life. Simple observations. Small adjustments. Gentle consistency. Those things often matter more than complicated systems. And if someone listening has struggled with recurring aphids year after year, I truly understand the frustration. It can feel discouraging to see fresh damage after putting so much care into the garden. But recurring pest problems do not mean you are failing as a gardener. Very often, they simply mean part of the larger system has not been noticed yet. Once I understood the connection between ants and aphids, everything changed. The visible damage finally started making sense. That understanding made the garden feel less confusing and far more manageable. Today, when I walk through the beds in early morning, I still occasionally find aphids. I still see ants now and then. But the overwhelming infestations are mostly gone because the balance has shifted. The garden regulates itself much more naturally now. And that may be the most important lesson of all. Healthy gardens rarely come from trying to control every detail. They improve when we learn how different parts of the system interact together. If you are experimenting with this kind of method for the first time, give yourself permission to go slowly. Observe the trails. Watch how insects behave. Notice changes over several days instead of expecting instant results overnight. Gardening rewards patience more often than speed. And climates will always shape results differently. In humid southern regions, insects may remain active much longer into the season. In cooler northern gardens, colonies may disappear earlier as temperatures drop. So try not to compare your garden too closely with someone else's. Your soil, weather, sunlight, and insect patterns are unique to your space. That individuality is part of what makes gardening interesting year after year. Even after decades of growing vegetables, I still notice new things each season. Certain methods work better in dry summers. Some plants resist pests naturally one year and struggle the next. The garden keeps teaching small lessons quietly over time. And perhaps that is why so many people continue gardening well into older age. There is always something gentle to learn. Not dramatic lessons. Small ones. A different planting location. A slower watering schedule. A healthier balance between insects. Little adjustments that slowly improve the whole environment. If you're comfortable sharing, I'm curious what pest gives you the most trouble in your garden each year. Sometimes hearing what others experience can be surprisingly helpful because many gardeners are dealing with the same patterns in different climates. And often, the best ideas come from simple observations shared over time. As for me, I still keep a small container of that mineral bait mixture ready each growing season. I do not use it constantly. Most of the time it simply sits on the shelf nearby. But knowing I have a calm, reliable method available has changed the way I feel about pest problems entirely. There is less panic now. Less rushing. Less spraying every few days. Instead, there is more watching. More understanding. More trust in gradual change. And interestingly, the garden itself seems healthier because of that shift. The plants look steadier. Beneficial insects appear more often. The soil feels more alive. Even watering becomes easier because the beds stay balanced more naturally. None of this happened overnight. It developed slowly through observation and smaller adjustments over many seasons. That is something gardening teaches beautifully. Real improvement often happens quietly. Aphids disappear one week. Pollinators return another week. Plants hold moisture longer after mulching. Soil becomes softer after years of compost. The changes build gently over time. And many of the best garden habits are surprisingly simple once we understand why they work. In the end, the biggest lesson this experience taught me had very little to do with insects themselves. It taught me to stop reacting so quickly to every problem I saw. Sometimes the first visible issue is only a symptom of something deeper happening underneath. Once we slow down enough to notice those hidden connections, solutions often become much simpler. And often much gentler too. That slower, gentler approach has made gardening far more enjoyable for me than constant fighting ever did. Now when I walk through the vegetable beds in the evening light, I notice healthier leaves, calmer insect activity, and a garden that feels more balanced overall. And perhaps most importantly, I feel calmer too. Sometimes the garden improves when we simply step back and observe.